I failed an honor student after she plagiarized her final essay, and her wealthy parents spent months trying to get me fired. Their plans backfired disastrously. I teach 11th grade English, and last fall I failed a girl named Kayla Merrick for the semester because she turned in a final essay she did not write. It was not a borderline case. She handed me a paper on the Great Gatsby that was copied almost word for word from something posted online, right down to a paragraph analyzing a novel she had never been assigned. I gave it a 0, which dropped her semester grade below passing, and I reported it as plagiarism the way our policy says to. I expected one hard conversation. What I got was 3 months of 2 adults trying to end my career. You need to understand what the Merricks were in that town. Greg Merrick sat on committees. He wrote the check for the new scoreboard and had his name put on it. Paula ran the booster club and knew a school board member by first name and used that first name in emails, the way other people use a badge number. I rent a 1-bedroom apartment 9 minutes from the building. I eat lunch at my desk. That was the matchup, and everybody in that district understood it before I did. Paula started with email. The first one said there had obviously been a mistake and I should fix it by the end of the day. When I explained what had happened, she wrote back that Kayla was an honor student who would never cheat and that I clearly had a problem with her daughter. Then the messages started arriving at 11 at night on weekends, 5 and 6 in a row, each one longer and angrier. She copied Vaughn, our principal, then the superintendent, then the board member. One email asked me, "Do you understand who my husband is in this town?" Another called me a small person who is threatened by a successful family. I answered every one of them calmly with the same facts, and every reply came back meaner than the last. Greg skipped me entirely and went to Vaughn and the superintendent's office and told them I was targeting his kid. Within a week, I was sitting across from Vaughn while he asked me to find a way to work with the family. He never once asked me whether Kayla had cheated. He asked whether this was really the hill I wanted to die on. He suggested I let her rewrite the essay for partial credit, as though the first one had simply not happened. I said no, because a rewrite is not how plagiarism works, and because I had 30 other kids in that class who did their own work, and who would figure out fast that the girl whose father bought the scoreboard got a private arrangement. Vaughn sighed and told me the Merricks were very involved, and that I should think about the bigger picture. They could smell how nervous the building was, and they pressed harder. Paula came to the front office twice, and demanded I be pulled out of class to speak with her. Greg left me a voicemail saying he had gotten teachers moved before, and that I should think hard about my mortgage. He told Vaughn I was unstable, and asked the office to survey my students about me, hoping somebody would hand him something usable. Kayla walked the halls telling people I was about to be in trouble. She handed back a worksheet one afternoon, smiled up at me and said, "My dad says you won't be working here next year." That was the week Artemis stopped me by the copier. She taught 2 doors down. She said the Merricks had done this to her 2 years earlier over a different grade, and that she had folded and bumped the number just to make it stop, and that the family had bragged about it to other parents for months afterward, so they had run this before. It had worked. They had every reason to believe it would work again. What actually started the ending was Greg getting greedy. He stood in Vaughn's office and demanded a formal grade review. He wanted my grade examined by the department and overturned on the record. I think he pictured a room of administrators who were scared of him quietly making an F disappear. When Vaughn asked whether I would agree to a formal review, I said yes immediately, and I meant it. Here is what the Merricks did not understand. A quiet grade change is a favor a nervous principal hands out in a hallway. A formal review is not that. Once it is on the record, the essay itself has to go in front of the department head and the academic integrity committee, sitting next to the source it was copied from, and it stops being my word against theirs. It becomes policy. I handed over Kayla's paper and the original, lined up side by side, along with the paragraph where she had forgotten to change the title of the book. The committee did not need long. It was never a question of whether I had been fair. It was a question of whether the work was hers, and it plainly was not. The finding did not just uphold the 0. Under the district's own rules, a confirmed plagiarism case on a final carried a permanent notation on her academic record, removal from the Honor Society, and a note that would travel with her transcript to every college she applied to. The Merricks had forced the school to look very closely at the one thing they should have wanted nobody to look at, and now it was official in a way no phone call from Greg could touch. Vaughn, who had been ready to fold a week earlier, could not go near an integrity finding without wrecking himself, so he backed off me entirely. And here's the part that tells you who these people are. They did not stop. On a Monday morning, Vaughn waved me into his office before I made it to my room. He sat on the edge of his desk instead of behind it, which I think was meant to feel casual. Greg had filed a formal complaint with the school board, not about the grade, about me. He was claiming I had been retaliating against Kayla since the review, singling her out, embarrassing her in front of other students, creating a hostile classroom. He wanted a board hearing. I had barely spoken to Kayla since the review. I called on her when her hand was up. I graded her work the same as everyone else's. I had gone out of my way to be flat and neutral precisely because I knew they would use anything. I asked Vaughn straight out if he believed a word of it. He paused just long enough for me to understand him, then said it did not matter what he believed, because they had filed it and the board had to look. That was the whole play. They could not undo the integrity finding, so they changed the target. If they could not make the F disappear, they would make me disappear, and the complaint did not even have to be true. It only had to exist long enough to drag me through a hearing and make my life miserable enough that I would leave on my own. That same week, my students went quiet on me. Not rude, careful. Kids who used to joke before the bell were suddenly studying their desks when I walked past. On Wednesday, one of them hung back after the room emptied, checked the door, and told me Kayla had been saying I was about to be fired, and that anyone who took my side would get caught up in it. Then she said Kayla was telling people her father had already talked to a lawyer, and she left before I could answer. Greg was working the board from above, and Kayla was working my classroom from inside it, making sure no student would be seen standing near me. It was efficient. I hated how efficient it was. I drove home that evening trying to plan and found Paula standing on my front porch. She was not shouting. She had her arms folded and a small, calm smile, like a neighbor dropping off a casserole. I walked up the path and she did not move. She said, in a completely level voice, that she had looked into me, that she knew I rented, that she knew my lease was up in 4 months, that she knew I had no family in this town. She said she wanted me to really think about whether this job was worth all of this. Every word was chosen. This was worse than the emails. This was her telling me she had done homework on my life and wanted me to know exactly how alone I was. I told her to get off my porch. She stepped down slowly, one stair at a time, and over her shoulder she said, "I'm trying to help you. No one else is going to." Then she drove off like she had finished a pleasant visit. I locked the door and the deadbolt and stood in my hallway for a full minute. When I finally sat down, I was shaking, and I want to be clear about why. I was not frightened. I was furious. She had come to my home and framed a threat as a favor and assumed that would be the thing that broke me. I called Artemis and said, before she could even say hello, that they had shown up at my house. The silence on her end was not surprise. It was memory. She said they had come to hers too, back then, and that was when she changed the grade. I told her I was not changing anything. She was quiet again, and then she said, "I know. That's why I'm going to help you this time." She said part of her was still afraid of them, but she was more afraid of watching it happen again and doing nothing. By the time I hung up, I was not shaking. I was planning. I started asking around the next day, quietly, no accusations, just simple questions. Had anyone else ever had a hard time with that family? Within 3 days, I had 2 answers. The first was a science teacher who had left the building 2 years before. I got her number through a mutual contact. She laughed when I said the name, but it was the laugh of somebody with a scar they do not discuss. Greg had called her principal and said she was incompetent because she gave Kayla a B+ instead of an A. She was not tenured. She did not fight it. She changed the grade, finished the year, and left teaching entirely. The second was a math teacher still in the building. I caught her in the copy room and she looked around before answering. Paula had emailed her 14 times in 1 week over a single test score, each message longer than the last, copying the superintendent by the end of it. She added points to the test, and the email stopped that day. 2 teachers in 3 days. 2 people steamrolled. Those were only the ones who answered me. Meanwhile, the hearing got scheduled 3 weeks out, and Vaughn called me in to tell me Greg had submitted a list of character witnesses: parents, board members, donors. I asked whether the board had any witnesses on my behalf. He looked at his desk and said that was my job to arrange, not his. So I sat at my desk during my free period and understood exactly what I was walking into. This hearing was not going to be about whether Kayla cheated, because everyone already knew she cheated. It was not going to be about whether I followed policy, because the integrity committee had already confirmed I had. It was going to be a popularity contest, a wealthy family with connections to half the board, and a row of people who owed Greg favors, against a teacher who rented an apartment and ate lunch alone. I needed people willing to say on the record that the Merricks had done this before. That night, I asked Artemis directly whether she would tell the board what happened to her. The pause was long enough that I checked the call was still connected. Then she said that if she did that, she was admitting she changed a grade she should not have changed, and she could face her own review. She was right. She was telling me that helping me might cost her something real, and I understood it completely. I told her I was asking anyway. She said she needed to think. After we hung up, I sat down at my dining table and did the thing I should have done in September. I pulled every email Paula had ever sent me and saved them into a folder. I saved the voicemails, including the mortgage one and the one where Greg said he had gotten teachers moved before. I saved the message asking whether I understood who her husband was. I backed all of it up to a flash drive and printed hard copies and put everything in date order, a timeline that showed the pressure building from a polite request to fix a mistake all the way to a woman standing on my porch reciting my lease terms. When I finished, the stack was almost an inch thick, and I realized I had stopped defending myself and started building a case that showed a pattern, a family running the same threats on teacher after teacher, year after year, never once held accountable, because every single person they targeted had folded, everyone except me. That Friday, Kayla stepped in front of me in an empty hallway. No audience this time. She said, "My parents always win. You know that, right?" No heat in it, just certainty. 2 months earlier, that line would have landed. But I had an inch of paper at home, and 2 teachers confirming the pattern. So I said, "Your parents have never played someone who kept the receipts." Her smile flickered. Something behind her eyes did the math and did not like the answer. She turned and walked off, and her shoes clicked all the way to the corner. 18 days out, I still had nobody willing to sit in that room with me. The science teacher had moved out of state and wanted no part of it. The math teacher said she could not afford to make enemies. Artemis was still deciding. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon while I was erasing my board, Artemis walked into my room carrying a manila folder, sat down in a student desk near the front, and set it on the surface in front of her. She said she had been thinking about this for 2 years, that when she changed that grade, she told herself she was being practical, and that she had not been practical. She had been a coward, and she had hated herself since. Her voice did not shake. Then she slid the folder across. The first page was a printed email from Paula, dated 2 years earlier. I started reading, and the hair came up on my arms. Same tone, same structure, sentences that opened reasonable and turned into threats dressed as concern for a child's education, same accusations of incompetence, same references to Greg's standing, and then the line that stopped me breathing. "Do you understand who my husband is?" Word for word. Not similar, identical. I looked up and asked why she had kept all of it. She said she kept it because she knew someday they would do it to somebody else, and she would need to prove she had not been lying about what happened to her. I asked if she would come. She did not pause this time. She said she would come, and she would say everything. I went home and spread it all across my dining table and built the thing I was going to hand the board. Her emails beside mine, matching phrases highlighted in yellow. "Do you understand who my husband is?" In both. "Pattern of incompetence." In both. "I would hate to see this become a bigger issue for you." In both. It was not a pattern. It was a script. They had never needed a new method because the old one had never failed. I printed the comparisons in triplicate so every board member could hold a copy and read the same sentence at the same second. I transcribed the voicemails onto index cards with dates and timestamps and laid them out earliest to latest. And reading them in order was like watching somebody take off a mask one piece at a time. I made a 1-page timeline that started 3 years back with the science teacher and ended with Paula on my porch. 2 days before the hearing, I got an email from a board member I had never spoken to, assuring me the board took these matters seriously and would review all evidence evidence fairly. Artemis identified him in 10 minutes. He was the one Paula knew by first name. I pulled up the district conflict of interest policy, found the clause requiring any board member with a personal relationship to either party to step aside from voting, and sent a formal recusal request to the chair citing the fact that he had been copied on Paula's emails for months. Within the hour, he emailed me directly, not through the chair, to assure me personally that he could be impartial. I did not reply. I saved it and put it in the binder. 4 days out, Vaughn called with an offer. Greg would withdraw the complaint if I agreed to transfer to a different school in the district. Good reference, fresh start. For about 3 seconds, it sounded like relief. Then my brain caught up with my stomach and I said out loud, "He's scared." Vaughn asked what. I said Greg was offering me an exit because he did not want that hearing to happen, because he knew what was going to come out of it. The man had spent months acting like he owned the town. Now, 4 days before the hearing he himself had demanded, he was offering a handshake. That is not confidence. That is a man who finally ran the numbers. I told Vaughn I was not transferring, and that I would see him at the hearing. The day before, Kayla was waiting near the edge of the staff lot, alone, and she looked nervous, which I had never seen on her. She said her mother told her I was going to try to embarrass them, that I had some kind of file. I did not confirm anything. I said she had copied an essay, and everything since then had happened because her parents chose to fight that instead of dealing with it. Her face tightened, and then very quietly she said, "You don't know what it's like in my house when I bring home a bad grade." And for 1 second I saw it. She was not angry, she was scared, and not of me. I told her I was sorry about that, and that I could not change what she turned in. She walked off fast toward the student lot. That night, Artemis called to tell me the math teacher had changed her mind. She had decided she could not afford to stay quiet either. 3 teachers, 3 years. One who folded and regretted it, one who left the profession, and one who was still standing. I stayed up past midnight putting the binder in final order and set my alarm for 6. I got to the hearing room at 3:40. Artemis was already there against the wall, folder in her lap, back straight. The math teacher came in 5 minutes later, pale, knuckles white on her bag strap, and sat down without a word. At 4, the chair and 3 board members took the long table. The flagged board member sat at the far end, while the chair read a short statement putting him there as an observer with no vote, per a conflict of interest request submitted before the hearing. I watched Paula's jaw set. She had been counting on that vote. Greg presented first, and it was clearly rehearsed. Dedicated student, honor roll. 1 grade throwing an entire academic career into question. Arbitrary grading. A classroom where his daughter felt targeted. He looked at each board member in turn and said, "My wife and I have tried to work with her respectfully, but she has refused to engage." Paula nodded along like a woman in church. Then the chair asked for my response. I stood, opened the binder, and laid 2 papers flat on the table. I said I wanted to start with the plagiarism, since that was what this was actually about. Kayla's essay on the left, the source on the right. I walked the matching passages one at a time. First paragraph, second, third, and then the paragraph near the end analyzing a novel that had never been assigned in my class, because that one had been lifted without even being edited. I said this was not a matter of my opinion, that these were the same words, and that the integrity committee had already confirmed it. The room went heavy quiet. Greg shifted. The chair asked whether the Merricks disputed the finding. Paula cut in before Greg got 2 words out and said they disputed how it was handled, that their daughter made a mistake and instead of helping her learn from it, I made an example of her. I said I had followed the plagiarism policy exactly, the same policy that applies to every student in my class. Then I said I wanted the board to understand what had happened since. I read the email asking whether I understood who her husband was in this town. I read the one calling me a small person threatened by a successful family. I held up my phone and played Greg's voice saying he had gotten teachers moved before and telling me to think hard about my mortgage. I described Paula on my porch with her arms crossed, telling me she knew I rented, knew my lease was up in 4 months, knew I had no family in town, and asking me to really think about whether this job was worth all of this. Nobody at that table was looking at the Merricks anymore. They were looking at the table. Greg said those were private communications taken out of context. The chair raised a hand without turning toward him and said, "Let her finish." So I said the sentence I had been holding for 3 months. I am not the first teacher this has happened to. Artemis stood. Her voice was clear. She said that 2 years earlier the Merricks pressured her to change a grade Kayla had earned in her class, that Paula sent her emails with the same language and the same threats and the same tone, that she changed the grade because she was scared, and that she had regretted it ever since. She walked her stack to the table and set it beside mine, and the yellow lines matched up from across the room. Then the math teacher stood, shaking, and said, Paula emailed her 14 times in 1 week over a test score and that she bumped the grade because she did not know what else to do. Her voice cracked on the last words and she stayed on her feet anyway. The room did not go quiet. It went still. Paula's mouth opened and closed and stayed closed. Greg stared at the wall behind the board like not moving might stop this. The chair picked up both stacks and read them side by side, eyes going back and forth, then passed them down the table, and nobody spoke while paper slid from hand to hand. When the last member set them down, the chair looked at Greg and said the board takes allegations of systematic intimidation of staff very seriously, and that based on what had been presented, the complaint against me was dismissed. Greg started to speak. The chair was not finished. He said he was further recommending a formal review of the family's interactions with school staff over the past 5 years. Everything drained out of Greg's face at once. The ease, the authority, the assumption that every room belonged to him. He leaned forward with a hand up to argue, and the chair cut him off. "You asked for this hearing, sir. These are the results." Paula took his arm and walked him out without looking at anyone. Artemis reached over and squeezed my hand. Vaughn sat in the back corner and said nothing, which was the most honest thing he had done all year. Through the glass in the hallway door, Kayla was still standing there. The lights went off behind her. Nobody turned them back on.